God, we thank you for this morning, and once again, we thank you for this time of worship when we can approach your throne of grace to come before with confidence. And this morning, Father, as we open our study and we begin to study the Gospel of Luke, we never want to take for granted the fact that you have given us your very words, the Word of God, that we hold the words of God in our hand. What an amazing thing to think about. That you've spoken to us, and you've inscribed it that we could have it now, thousands of years later. Father, even though we didn't walk with Jesus when he walked the face of this earth, we read the stories, we understand the love and the compassion and the grace that you have for us through what we read in your word. And so, Father, may it be that which we treasure within our heart. And Father, I pray that as we go through our study in the Gospel of Luke, that we have a new gratitude for your word, a new appreciation for your word, a new sanctity for your word as we look at it and realize that you have given us your very word. And so, Lord, may we never, ever take that for granted. So speak to us this morning, for we ask it in the precious name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. You may be seated and the children may be dismissed. As I mentioned, we are starting our study in the Gospel of Luke this morning. And I will say this. I went through Bible school, I went through graduate school, and I am always amazed at how much more I learn when I get to dig deep into these studies. And I'm going to tell you, we're going to not be doing a shallow flyover of the book of Luke. We're digging deep into this book, and I want you to come out because you're going to see things in this book that, I was blown away this week myself. I'm like, wow, I've studied this before and gone through, I went through my Bible degree was in advanced biblical studies, and I still look at this stuff and like, I didn't see this stuff when I studied it. He says here in Luke 1, and we're only going to go through the first 4 verses. Now, don't let that fool you. Just because I'm doing 4 verses doesn't mean the sermon's going to be short, okay? Never let that, escape your notice. Luke writes and he says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things that you've been taught." I read a surprising statistic the other day. 33% of all high school students, when they graduate high school, never read another book again in their life, an entire book. 42% of all college students never read an entire book again after they graduate from college. I get that. No, I have a practice because I believe to be a good teacher, you have to be a good learner. And my wife calls me a perpetual student because I'm always taking classes from somewhere. And I mean that literally. I'm always in classes somewhere. Usually online now, obviously. But I still try to read at least 1 book a month. I'll take a book and like a chapter a day from that book during my devotional time or something like that, because I feel like reading keeps me sharp. It challenges me to think deeper about things, and I am a continual learner. Now, while I've read a lot of books, let me be honest and say that there's never really been any that really changed the way I viewed an issue until a couple years ago I read a book which was very interesting. It was a book by Philip Yancey and Paul Brand called The Gift of Pain. And the reason I read that book is because I like the author, Philip Yancey. He's a very deep spiritual thinker. Paul Brand was a surgeon during World War II from Britain. And they wrote a book on why does God allow pain in our lives? How can pain be a gift from God? And to answer that question, you got to read the book. I'm not going to tell you. But I will say this, it really revolutionized my way that I view pain in life. Now, many of us have read books that were compelling. Many of us have read books that were very inspirational to us. Some of them have even given us deeper insights into a particular issue. But there's one story that obviously stands out above all the rest. And you know what I find interesting is that Hollywood, when they made it into a movie, they aptly entitled it "The Greatest Story Ever Told," which is the last thing they did right. But they said the greatest story ever told. And this story, the gospel of Jesus Christ, is indeed the greatest story ever told. And we are given that story by 4 different authors, by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, that brings up an interesting question, because many times as people are reading, and I encourage people to always read through the Bible, as they're reading through it, sometimes I'll have somebody come to me and say, well, Pastor, how come there are 4 Gospels? Why not just one Gospel? Why didn't all these 4 guys just get together, convene together, and say, okay, let's put this book together? And the main reason is that one Gospel alone would not do justice to the ministry of Jesus Christ. Jesus was sent to redeem humanity. So each gospel writer wrote to a different audience for a different purpose, to give a unique perspective of the Son of God. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the synoptic gospels. And I hear people sometimes throw that word out and they don't understand what that word means. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are synoptic gospels. John is not. Synoptic is a compound word. S-Y-N means the same, and then optic, as you would understand, means to view or to see something. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all see Jesus from the same angle, you might say. Matthew, Mark, and Luke view together a similar view of the earthly life of Jesus. They talk about the person of Jesus Christ. They focus on his Galilean ministry. Galilee was in the north, Judea in the south. So most of his ministry took place in the Galilean region. And in fact, there's even something called the Evangelical Triangle, where you can take 3 cities in the north, just above the Sea of Galilee, draw a triangle around them, and you'll find that about 80% of all ministry Jesus did was right in that area right there. But they focus on the Galilean ministry. Now, John is a little different. John's gospel focuses on the deity of Jesus Christ, primarily focusing on his Judean ministry, the things that happened that he did down in Jerusalem, in those areas down there. So while Matthew, Mark, and Luke all speak of Jesus from that human perspective, John's gospel appears to focus more on the spiritual aspect of Jesus' ministry. And while Matthew, Mark, and Luke all share similar views of Jesus, they present his earthly ministry to different audiences with different perspectives. And I want to take some time this morning just briefly to go through that, so you'll understand why we have the 4 Gospels and understand why we're focusing in today on Luke. Let me say one thing too, is that you're going to find, if you're here with us for a period of time, you're going to find that every once in a while I'll go through several books and then boom, I come back to one of the Gospels. And there's a reason for that. When I was mentored as a pastor, the pastor that I considered one of my mentors, he told me, he said, never stay too far, never drift too far from the Gospels. Always keep bringing the Gospels back to your people. And I believe that's wise advice. Matthew, known as Matthew Levi, appears to have been a Jew from a family line of Levites, which were the priesthood. And he was probably trained up in the Levitical priesthood, and for whatever reason he abandoned it. Because what we find when we come to Matthew in the gospel, we find out that he's a tax collector for the Romans. Well, the Jews considered any tax collector a traitor, because the Romans would tax them, and they didn't believe that they should be taxed by Rome. They wanted to be autonomous and all. And so for a Jew to become a tax collector was a bad thing, a very bad thing. And so he was an outcast of society. Now, when he came to faith in Jesus Christ, as many of you know, he abandoned that position as a tax collector. They were very wealthy people because they could tax a person however they wanted to. He abandoned that. He gave it all up to follow Jesus Christ. Matthew writes his gospel to a Jewish audience to show that Jesus is this Messiah that's promised in the Old Testament. Now, let me say this. The Jews they don't refer to it as the Old Testament, because they don't acknowledge the New Testament. They don't acknowledge Jesus, so they don't acknowledge the New Testament. So when you hear Jews speak of the Scriptures, they're speaking of what we call the Old Testament. But to them, that's the complete Scripture there. And so Matthew, when he writes, he makes references to the Old Testament 99 times in his book. And he'll talk about different things, fulfillments of prophecy. He presents Jesus as the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he makes references to the Old Testament because Matthew's favorite phrase you're going to find in his is that it might be fulfilled. And then he'll quote a passage of Scripture from the Old Testament. So he's taking people who know the Scriptures and saying, look, this person Jesus here, Look over here. See this scripture that you memorized? It's fulfilled by him. And so he's writing this from a very Jewish perspective. He's writing to people who have a knowledge of the scriptures already. Now, it is interesting because Matthew gives us a genealogy of Jesus Christ. And how does he give us his genealogy? He traces it back through David, who was much revered by the people as the greatest king that ever ruled over Israel. And then it goes all the way back to Abraham, who was the father of the nation. That was the beginning of the nation of Israel. And so, that makes a lot of sense. The Messiah would come through the line of David. Abraham's the father of the Jews. That's where he gives us that genealogy. Now, Mark's gospel is a little different. And if you've been here for some time, you've probably gone through Mark's gospel with me. It was written to a Roman audience. It was written to Gentiles, non-Jews. Mark writes about Jesus from the perspective of Jesus as a servant who ministers to the physical and the spiritual needs of people. And that isn't surprising. It's estimated that at that time in Rome, there were about 10 million slaves in the Roman Empire at that time. Approximately 2 out of every 10 people were slaves, were indentured servants. And one thing I said a while back was that when we go through Luke, I'm going to give you a lot of cultural background to understand what was going on at that time to get a better picture of what we're talking about. Because, a lot of times we tend to read the Bible and we read it in light of our own culture. You know what I mean? We read it in light of what we understand our culture to be. And we got to sort of get our mindset out of that and go back to what was the culture like at that time. And so I'm going to bring in some of that nuance as we talk about that. You rarely see the scriptures where Jesus pulls out a cell phone and says, hey, Matthew, I need you over here for a minute. A little humor there. Not much, obviously. But Jesus is portrayed as the one who came to serve and not be served. The one who became a ransom for many, as it says in Mark 10:45. Now, here's another interesting thing about it. When you go into the Gospel of Mark, guess what? You have no genealogy. Why is that? Because servants didn't have a genealogy. They didn't care about the genealogy of a servant. It was never recorded. Luke's Gospel is, again, by a Gentile. It's interesting because Luke is the only Gentile writer in the entire New Testament. Everybody else was Jewish. He's the only Gentile. So he had quite a high honor here. He writes to a Gentile audience to present Jesus and his humanity. And what you'll find is that Luke often refers to Jesus as the Son of Man. In fact, he does that 26 times in his gospel. And because Luke is presenting Jesus Christ as the perfect man, he takes his genealogy all the way back to the first man. He takes it back to Adam and traces the lineage all the way through to the time of Jesus. Now, Luke has this very universal outlook. He's portraying Jesus as a compassionate Savior of the world, and he includes stories about the rich and the poor, Jews and Gentiles, women, outcasts of society. And Luke includes many parables in his account. Now, here's what's exciting as we go through the Gospel of Luke. 18 of the 25 parables that are recorded that Jesus gave are unique, I should say, to the Gospel of Luke. So out of all the 25 parables that we have, 18 of them you only find in the Gospel of Luke. And when we get to these parables, we're going to dig deep into these and to look at these parables. Luke's readers don't have a background in the scriptures like Matthew's readers, the Jews, did. So what you're going to find is that Luke is going to do something a little bit different than Matthew. Instead of going, well, this is the fulfillment of this scripture back here, because a person who didn't have any Bible background would go, well, who's Moses? Who's Noah? I mean, who are these people? I don't know who they are. So how do you reach someone who doesn't know the Bible? You do it the very same way that our missions teams were doing it down in El Salvador, and now they're doing it in Africa. You tell people stories. We learn to take the gospel and tell the stories of the scripture as conversational stories. And so Luke tells these parables, records these parables that Jesus told, and his readers understand Jesus and the scriptures through these parables. And so that's why you see this plethora of parables in the Gospel of Luke. John's Gospel is a little different. John's Gospel, as I mentioned earlier, focuses on the deity of Jesus Christ. And he focuses more on the meaning of Jesus' actions than the actions themselves. So his emphasis is more about who Jesus is as opposed to what Jesus did. And his genealogy is very simple. How do you give a genealogy of God? Well, it's very simple because you find it in the very first verse of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Boom, there's your genealogy. Very simple. Now, you look at these 4 Gospels, and you look at the different perspectives, the different audiences, and you realize something really interesting. The Holy Spirit has given us 4 Gospels so that we have the knowledge of Jesus Christ that he wants us to have about him. You can't eliminate any of them because they all fit together like a puzzle piece to give us the bigger picture of Jesus. And so this morning we begin our study in Luke, and we're going to take a very in-depth look at the introduction as a foundation for the rest of this book. Why do we do that? Because understanding the man behind the message will help us to understand the message. So let's dig in here. Luke begins by saying, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us." Luke speaks of many who have undertaken this task to write an account about the life of Jesus Christ. So that tells us something. It wasn't just Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There weren't just 4 guys who said, hey, I think we'll write a gospel. No, there were a lot of people that wanted to write about Jesus or talk about Jesus. Luke doesn't identify any of these early sources, but obviously the things that Jesus did created curiosity among the people. I mean, face it, when you go out and you start healing lepers, when you start healing sick people, when you start raising people from the dead, people are going to talk. They're going to be, like, whoa, what happened there? Because, this is the real deal. And people were obviously talking about Jesus because one day Jesus is in Caesarea Philippi with his disciples, and there's a whole other message you can make about that, but he gathers his disciples together. Caesarea Philippi was steeped with a lot of idolatry and a lot of false gods, and so they're standing there at the foot of Mount Hermon, and Jesus says, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And guess what? They immediately have answers. They immediately go, "Oh yeah, well, some people think you're John the Baptist. Some people think you're Elijah or Jeremiah. Some think you're one of the other prophets." What's that tell us? They had been listening to the conversations of other people. They had been listening to what people were saying. "What do you think about Jesus?" "Well, I'll tell you what I think about Jesus." "What do you think about Jesus?" "Well, I'll tell you what I think about Jesus." And they had listened to all these opinions about who Jesus was. There were many extra biblical writings that did not give an accurate account of the life of Jesus. And not that I spent a lot of time researching this, but there were other gospels that came out. And one of them was called the infancy gospel of Thomas. And it was a writing, and I have not read through the entire book, neither do I really want to, but it's interesting because one of the stories in that quote-unquote gospel was that when Jesus was a little boy, he was playing by a stream one day, and he was taking clay out of the stream, and he was making these little birds, these little sparrows out of it. And he was doing it on the Sabbath, and a Jewish, a Levite priest saw him doing it, and he rebuked Joseph and said, "How come your son's doing this on the Sabbath like that?" And so his father comes and says, "Oh, Jesus, you shouldn't be doing that." And Jesus claps his hands, and the little birds become to life and fly away. How cute. That's a cute story, but it's not accurate. How do we know it's not accurate? Because when you compare it with the scriptures tell you it's not accurate. Well, how do they do that? Well, you go into John's gospel and you find that Jesus and his disciples are invited to a wedding in Cana of Galilee, right? And remember, they go there and they run out of wine. And his mother comes to him and says, "Hey, they're out of wine." Like that. He says, "All right, I'll run to Wawa." No, he doesn't say that. No, he says, "What do I have to do with you? My time hasn't come yet." That's a Hebrew idiom. It wasn't any disrespect at all. And she looks at the servants. She goes, "Do whatever he tells you to do." So he tells them to gather the water pots together and to do all this and all. And he turns the water into wine. Now it's interesting what John says, and sometimes we miss the nuances in Scripture and we don't realize how significant they are. Because when you go into that passage, John says, this is the first of his signs. Jesus did this in Cana of Galilee. This is the first of his signs, which tells you that Jesus did not perform miracle as a little kid. He wasn't just randomly going out there and going, "Hey, you want to see me pull a rabbi out of my hat?" Rabbi, not rabbit, rabbi. It's Jewish, okay? But Jesus didn't perform miracles as a child because we know that from the Scriptures. And the only accurate accounts that still existed at that time when Luke wrote his gospel were the ones that were already written by Mark and probably by Matthew. John wasn't written yet at that time as far as we know, but Mark was probably the first gospel written, then Matthew, then Luke writes his. Now, Luke tells us the purpose of his gospel was to compile an account of the things accomplished among us. Luke wanted to give his readers an orderly account of what God accomplished in sending his Son to the earth to redeem mankind. And the word accomplished is again significant because it's an intensive compound word that indicates the complete fulfillment of something. In this case, obviously redemption. And that lines up right with Scripture. Because what did Jesus say when he was on the cross? As he was about to breathe his last, he said, "It is finished." Greek, telestai. Telestai means to be paid in full. It was accomplished. And Jesus, the night before, when he was praying in the garden, he said to his heavenly Father, "I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work which you have given me to do." Now, I'll tell you what, that's a miracle in itself. Do you ever feel like you ever accomplished the work you need to do? I come home and I go, man, I can't believe all the things I got to do. I told my wife, I said, I'm not working out in the yard anymore because every time I get one job done, I say 3 more that need to be done. But Jesus accomplished everything he came to do. Jesus didn't leave any unfinished business. He accomplished that purpose of redemption. Now, notice that Luke says that he compiled this account. This is something very important to understand. This implies that he accumulated his information from other sources. You see, Luke was not one of the 12. He was not one of the apostles, not one of the disciples. He did not travel with Jesus during his earthly ministry. He traveled with Paul during his ministry in the early church, but he wasn't traveling with Jesus at that time. Therefore, Luke had to rely on others for his information about Jesus Christ. And we're going to find that the information that we have in the book of Luke, that Luke did a good job of it, because you know what? We have information in the Gospel of Luke we don't have in any of the other Gospels. That if we didn't have the Gospel of Luke, this is information we would not know. So I tell you what, to me, this is just a treasure trove of understanding more about Jesus Christ. Well, let's look at the source of his information. Luke explains the source. He says, "They were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the Lord." So Luke compiled this information for his gospel from those who had observed the ministry of Jesus Christ firsthand. These individuals, we're told, are eyewitnesses. Now, the word that he uses there, autoptes, is actually where we get our word autopsy. You say, well, no, wait a minute, that's sort of weird. Well, autoptes literally means to see it for yourself. And it speaks of doing a detailed examination of something. When a medical examiner says, hey, we need to do an autopsy on this body, if there's been an unusual death or a strange death or a questionable death about how this person died, they do an autopsy on it because they want to do a detailed examination of the person to figure out exactly what caused that death. Was it foul play? Was it natural causes? What was it? And so Luke tells us here that basically he's going to do this detailed examination or give us this detailed information from those who walk with Jesus Christ. Now, think about this for a moment. Think about the fact that Luke went and he interviewed these people and he talked to these people. Luke went to Zacharias and Elizabeth about the events leading up to the birth of their son John. Luke spoke to Mary about the experiences of when the angel came and made that announcement to her. Behold, you're with child. And she's like, well, wait a whole second. I haven't been doing anything I shouldn't be doing. And then Joseph's doubt and what happened to my wife? Why did my fiance? Why did she do this? And he felt betrayal. And then the Lord came to him. The angel came to him and said, no, this is from God. Luke spoke with Mary about her visit to Elizabeth. He spoke to Mary about the traveling to Bethlehem. How was to travel on a donkey for who knows how far while you're like 9 months pregnant? Ladies, not probably not a good thing. But he interviewed all of them and he talked to them about these things. He talked to Mary about the escape under darkness when the angel told him, hey, you need to get out of town right now because Herod's going to kill the child. Luke spoke to the widow of Nain, who, when Jesus came along, touched her son and raised him from the dead. Luke heard about the healing of the 10 lepers. All these amazing stories that Luke gathers this information on. And so as we go through the book of Luke, we're going to find information, again, we don't find anywhere else in the Gospels. And so, to me, this is an exciting book to study. So, if nothing else, we have at least one person that's excited about it. But, Luke tells us that he compiled this information in an orderly pattern. Now, Luke explains the methodology. He says, seems fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write out for you in consecutive order. Now I want to stop there for a minute. I want you to look at this. Luke seeks to do three things in this gospel. He wants to make it accurate, he wants to make it thorough, and he wants to make it orderly. So first, he wants to make it accurate. So he tells us that he investigated everything carefully. Now this is, again, where it really gets sort of neat, because Luke uses a word for carefully. It's acrobos. It's where we get our word acrobat. And if you go back and you look at it, the word means to walk on the tip. It's speaking of someone who's walking on a tightrope. And just as a tightrope walker needs to be very careful to maintain their balance, Luke is very careful to give us a balanced investigation of the life of Jesus Christ. And as a physician, Luke was trained to make careful assessment of those who came to him with an illness so he could properly diagnose their problem. So Luke uses the same care that he would have given, to give this accurate account that he would have given someone he was doing a diagnosis on as a physician. Now, second, Luke says he wants to make it thorough. So he's telling us that he started from the beginning. And the word there, anothen, in the Greek, speaks to be from the beginning, or it can mean from above. It's the same word that Jesus used with Nicodemus when he said, "You must be born again." Now remember, I don't know if some of you remember this, but back in the 80s, that was the big phrase, born again, born again. And then you know something, Billy Graham changed the word, and he started saying being born from above. And actually, that is an acceptable and equally acceptable translation of that word. You must be born from above. And I like the fact that Luke uses it here, because it seems to be implying that he did all the work to compile this information and be accurate about it, but he was being guided by the Holy Spirit as he put it together to present it to us. So it came from above. Now, third, Luke wants it to be orderly, and he says he's going to do it in consecutive order. With very few exceptions, maybe 2 or 3, the entire Gospel of Luke is in chronological order. If you ever look at a chronology of the 4 Gospels, a parallel of the 4 Gospels, you'll find Luke goes all the way down, and then all the other ones are inserted in, because Luke has more information than the rest of them. But, so that he's basically the guideline for all the rest of them. But some of them put it in different orders because they grouped it like in parables, or they grouped it in, things, opposition, or whatever it may be. But Luke gives us a chronological order of the life of Jesus Christ. So if you want to read the life of Jesus Christ in the order that it occurred, Luke is the gospel for you to read. So, as I mentioned earlier, he's very meticulous in his investigation because he's a physician by trade. And he's described by the Apostle Paul, interestingly enough, as the beloved physician in Colossians. And I like that, because that tells us something else about Luke. You see, there were 2 classes of physicians in the ancient world. There were the wealthy had physicians as servants or as private employees of their families. But there was another class of physician, and today we would call them the quacks. The ones that really weren't, didn't really know what they were doing and all, but they basically made money off of people. They were the charlatans who took advantage of the naive, and they took advantage of them for financial gain. And we see an example of that in Mark's gospel. Remember the woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years. And she had never been healed. And it's interesting what Mark tells us, that she had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. So basically, she had been sucked in by these people and said, "Oh, well, I can cure you. Oh, I can take care of this. Oh, I can fix this for you." And she'd spent all of her money, and now it was all gone. She had no resources, and she comes to Jesus, and she's healed. But the false physicians were evidently more prolific than the legitimate physicians. In fact, in the New Testament, there's only 7 references to physicians, and 6 out of 7 are in a negative sense. So there was a lot of problems back in that day, and that's why people came to Jesus for healing, because many of them had probably suffered under people who were just quacks out there making money off of them. It's interesting though, because I was reading. I like doing some fun reading. I read for studying, but I also like doing some fun reading. And the other day I was reading home remedies of people in Appalachia. back in like the 20s and 30s and 40s and stuff like that. And so I was reading these different home remedies, and so I was getting ready to go to bed, so I'm sitting there one night and I start laughing. My wife comes and goes, "What's so funny?" I said, "Man, you would not believe some of these home remedies that the Appalachian people used at the time." And I just want to share one with you. So they had a home remedy for asthma, and I'm going to quote it to you. "Swallow a handful of spider webs rolled into a ball." So, if you have asthma, that is not the type of doctor you want to go to. If he starts rolling up spider webs into a ball, you may say, "You know what, I think I'll go over to another doctor here, find another one." And there were other great ones too. But you know what I found was sort of funny was, I was reading through all these, they had asthma and gout and all these other things and all that. And a lot of them had to do with whiskey. So it was like, it was like, take some whiskey with this and take some bootleg whiskey with and so it was sort of interesting. But they had all these quacks back in those days. I guess they still have them today. But we see the physician come out in Luke simply by some of the stories he records in this gospel, and you see that doctor come out in him. The woman who had been bent over for 18 years and is healed by Jesus. Or the story of Jesus praying in Gethsemane. And remember what it says? It says that he prayed as with sweat drops of blood. He began to sweat drops of blood. There's an actual medical term there, hematidrosis. Hematidrosis is when you are under such stress and under such pressure that the capillaries in your forehead break and it begins to mix with your sweat glands and you actually start to sweat blood. Very rare condition, but it does happen. We see the story, he talks about the healing of Malchus' ear when Peter cut it off by the sword. And I always love that one. I always find that humorous because every single gospel talks about it. It says a certain disciple cut off the ear of the slave. A certain disciple cut off the ear of the slave. A certain disciple cut off the ear of the slave. You get to John, he goes, "Peter did it." He just points it out. Peter did it. So we know Peter did it because John dined him out, and they're also the two that raced to the garden to see who could get there quickest. A little competition going on maybe, But it's funny because wouldn't that be interesting to a physician? Somebody's ear is sliced off and then Jesus just comes up and touches it and the ear is completely formed and healed in a moment's time. You look at that and you go, wow, oh, that's a story for you. As a physician, Luke was fascinated by the medical miracles of Jesus. Now, Luke was also a well-educated man, obviously, and once again, we see this in the way that he writes his gospel. Luke uses 312 Greek words that aren't used anywhere else in the New Testament. Nowhere else are they used. And to addition to that, remember Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and he also wrote Acts. He uses 50 different medical terms in Luke and Acts combined. So I find that very interesting. Compare this with the Gospel of John, and it's very interesting because the Gospel of John, the entire Gospel only has 600 different Greek words in the entire Gospel, and it's written at about a 4th grade level. Now, that's not diminishing John's Gospel. A lot of times when a person's a new believer, I tell them, what's the first thing I should read? You should read John's Gospel. Why? Because it gives you just a simple overview of Jesus as the Son of God. Not a hard read. A very easy read. And so there's a reason why John wrote that way. There's a reason why Luke wrote this way. Now, Luke names the original intended recipient of this letter, Most Excellent Theophilus, and that's also how he does when he gets to the book of Acts. He talks about, Most Excellent Theophilus. Now, we have no other information about this man Theophilus, and so we can sort of draw some speculation, some assumptions about this man. I have one of my own. I believe that when he was born, he probably became one of the most mischievous kids in the family because he has the awfulest name of anyone. He's the awfulest kid on the block. I know that's the awfulest joke I've said all week. Okay, so all kidding aside, so some of you it takes you a long time to get those jokes done. Some of you, you're driving down the road after the service and it's like, you're finally done. No, but Theophilus, Theophilos, lover of God. And so, I want to make an assumption here. I believe that it's quite possible that his parents had some type of spiritual background. And so they named their son lover of God. And based on his name, he wanted to know more about Jesus Christ. He probably had some spiritual background, and so when he heard about Jesus Christ, he was fascinated. He may have been, it says most excellent Theophilus. Now, I want to say this, most excellent often implies an official title. Luke uses that same title in the book of Acts for the Roman procurators, for Felix and for Festus and all. He addresses them most excellent Felix, most excellent Festus. Many Bible scholars believe that Luke may have been the slave of Theophilus, the indentured servant. And it was common in those days for a wealthy person to take one of their servants who had a lot of promise, who had a lot of intelligence, and send them off to medical school, and then they became their personal doctor. It was cheaper for them, just like it is today. It's cheaper to own a doctor than to pay insurance for one. Just saying. I was transporting a lady, and she was really nervous going to the hospital. I transported one day, and she got into her room, and we were getting her set up, and I was giving the report to the nurse. And down the hallway, we heard some woman scream, and man, my patient's eyes just got really big, and I put my hand on her hand and I said, "Don't worry, they just got the bill." Last thing I want to bring up, Luke tells us the goal of the writing of this gospel, so that you may know the exact truth about the things that you've been taught. Luke wants us to know the exact truth about the things we've been taught. Some other translations may say that you may know it with certainty. The Greek word there, Luke carries the idea of something that's unable to slip. And I like that, because he doesn't want us to slip away from our faith. This verse also may give us some further insight into the recipient of this letter, Theophilus. He may have been a new believer who wanted to be established in his faith, and because the Greek word that he uses there for taught is katekeo, and it's where we get our word catechumen, or if you've heard of catechism, it speaks of someone being taught the basics of Christianity. So it sounds like Theophilus wanted to understand the basics of Christianity, so Luke writes this gospel. And many people believe, and I could see this, is that if he was a servant of Theophilus, basically Theophilus says, look, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you freedom and leeway to travel and to do your research, and then I want you to come back, but I want you to tell me the story. And so Luke, out of gratitude, wrote this gospel and presents it to Theophilus as sort of a gift to tell him about Jesus Christ. And to me, that's beautiful, because, hey, anytime we have an opportunity to share the gospel with somebody, what can you say? But I want to wrap up here real quickly with what we learned from this introduction. Well, first we learned that we've been given a detailed account that's accurate and orderly of the life of Jesus Christ. We don't have to question the veracity of what Luke writes. We have it from eyewitnesses as he compiled it in this chronological order. But secondly, I believe that we're sort of given, if you will, an unspoken challenge by Luke to do the same thing. Again, not to go back to looking for eyewitnesses, but we're called to be students of God's Word. I was talking to a friend of mine just the other day, and we were talking about that many believers don't read the Word of God on a regular basis. It's sort of like an optional thing. And let me say this, that doesn't make any sense to me. And here's why I say that. If you're a true believer and you desire to be conformed to the image of Christ, which is our goal as believers, the only way to do that is to know the Word of God, to know the life of Jesus Christ, to read His Word. And to me, that is the greatest gift we've been given short of salvation, is the fact that we have God's Word. We don't have to guess about it. We have to wonder what He would do. We can go right to the Word. We can read the Word. We can see it for ourselves. And I believe that we should be spending a little bit of time each day in the Word. Now, it doesn't have to be an hour. I mean, I understand people have different schedules and a lot, but we should at least spend 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day in reading the Word. And so I want to leave you, as always, with a challenge today. I want to challenge you in the next 4 weeks, I want to challenge you to read through the Gospel of Luke. And I want you to do it a chapter a day. Just one chapter a day. In fact, let's see, tomorrow's the 31st. If you want to, start on Tuesday and then read chapter 1 on the 1st of the month, chapter 2 on the 2nd, chapter 3 on the 3rd, and 4th, and go through it. And in less than 4 weeks, just a little over 3 weeks, you will have read through the entire gospel. But I don't want you just to zip through it and just read through it for the sake of, well, Pastor told me to read through it. And then you're out the door. Not a real good idea. You don't get a whole lot from that. But if you just read through it, Maybe read through it 3 times. Read through it early in the morning, read through it at your lunch break, then read through it in the evening before you go to bed. I like reading the Bible a lot of times before I go to bed because it puts it into my mind before I go to sleep. And it's very interesting, that it sort of seems like you have that retention. In fact, research has indicated that a lot of times when you study right before you go to sleep, you retain more. And so just a suggestion for you, but to read through it so that when we get to these passages, it's like, wow, I never read that before. No, you can say, I've read that tons of times. Let's see what he has to say about it. And then you can correct me during the service. No, I'm kidding. Don't do that. But that's the challenge I want to lead with you this morning. Just to read through it, and let's dig deep into this study, and let's enjoy it. And you know what? Invite other people to come to hear this, because this is the fullness of this gospel is exciting, and I think that we should be sharing this with other people. Or you know what? If you don't have somebody that comes with you to church, then take it to them. Say, hey, you're really interested. I was reading something, in our study at church about about Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, and just share it with them. A lot of times, I go out and I just share things with people and throw it out there just to see if they bite on it, if they're willing to talk about it. And a lot of times they are. So let's dig deep into our study in Luke and allow God to also work deeply in us while we're doing that. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for your word this morning. And we thank you that Luke was so committed to giving us a detailed, accurate, orderly presentation of your Son, Jesus Christ. Father, we're so blessed, and sometimes we don't realize it, to have your word, to be able to hold your word in our 2 hands. So Father, let us not take that for granted. But as we go forth in our study, may we dig deep, and not just to have a mind filled with facts, but to have a heart that embraces your Son, Jesus Christ, in a way that it's never been before. And I'm not just talking about going from unbelief to belief, but going from belief to that deeper relationship that you desire us to have, that intimacy that you desire us to have with your Son, Jesus Christ, that we may thereby grow and be conformed to the image of your Son, and do those things and live those lives that are pleasing to you. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you.
Please stand as we close the song. You guys have a wonderful week. Thank you for coming this morning.